The collapse happened on a Tuesday, which was the kind of detail that later seemed important to people who needed things to feel organized when everything else had fallen apart. The Harlan County Emergency Management Office logged it at 4:17 in the afternoon. A secondary tunnel in the Beaumont shaft, not active for production but still used for equipment access, had given way after 3 days of rain that had been working at the old timbering in ways that the structural assessment from 2 years ago had not adequately predicted. The assessment was on file. The file had been reviewed. The timeline of what happened between the file and the collapse was something that lawyers would be discussing for years. None of that was what anyone in the town of Cutters Creek was thinking about that Tuesday evening, because what everyone in Cutters Creek was thinking about was the Doberman. She had been at the mine since before the collapse was reported, because her owner had been inside the tunnel when it went, and she had followed him to the shaft that morning the way she followed him everywhere, and she had been at the entrance when the ground shook, and she had not moved since. 9 days later, when Patrick Callahan drove his truck down the county road and saw the yellow tape and the dog, she was still there, and she had the look of an animal that had made a decision so complete that no external argument was going to reach it. Patrick pulled over. He sat in his truck for a long time looking at her through the windshield. Then he turned off the engine and opened the door, and the dog looked at him across the rubble and the tape and the 9 days, and neither of them moved for a while, and that was how it started. Tell us in the comments which city you are watching from, and subscribe to this channel before we go further. Because what Patrick Callahan and that Doberman did next was not the story anyone in Cutters Creek expected. And the reason it mattered as much as it did had everything to do with who Patrick Callahan was, and what he had come back to Kentucky to figure out. And the dog, whose name was Raven, and who had been standing guard for 9 days over a man who was not going to come back out of the ground, had been waiting for someone who understood that particular kind of vigil, even if he did not yet know it. Patrick Callahan was 43 years old, and had the face of someone who had been Irish in a very Irish way for a very long time, which meant square-jawed and fair-skinned, with red-blonde stubble going copper at the edges and blue eyes that people who had known him since childhood described as the color of early sky before weather arrived, which was accurate, and which also described something about the quality of waiting in them, the sense of a forecast being prepared. He had grown up in Cutters Creek, in the coal country of Harlan County, Kentucky, where the mountains were old and green and full of what the mountains had always been full of, which was coal and family and the specific pride of people who did difficult necessary work with their bodies, and expected that work to be respected, and were correct to expect that even when the expectation was not met. His father had worked the Beaumont shaft for 30 years. His uncle had worked it before that. The Callahan family's relationship to Harlan County coal was not simple or sentimental. It was practical and long, and contained both the things that coal had given the family and the things it had taken, and both of those tallies were long. Patrick had understood this from childhood with the specific clarity of a boy raised by people who did not romanticize their circumstances, but also did not apologize for them. He had left Cutters Creek at 18, not to escape it, but to do what the mountain had never been able to do for any Callahan, which was send one of them somewhere that could not be collapsed by rain. He had become a Navy SEAL at 23 after 2 years in the regular Navy, and he had served for 19 years in places so different from Harlan County that the distance sometimes felt less geographical than metaphysical. Dust and heat, and the particular smell of places where things had recently gone wrong. He had been good at the work in the particular way that men from hard places are sometimes good at difficult work, not because they lack imagination about what can go wrong, but because they have already been living alongside what can go wrong and have developed a relationship with it that is neither reckless nor paralyzed. He had been on 3 long deployments and 2 classified operations whose details he would not discuss with anyone in Cutters Creek, and had not discussed with anyone anywhere except the men who had been there with him. And he had left the Navy 14 months ago with a medical discharge for a shoulder that had finally refused to cooperate with what was being asked of it, and with the specific, wordless exhaustion of a man who has been operating at full capacity for 19 years, and has been told that the capacity is no longer available, and who has not yet located another relationship with himself. He had come back to Cutters Creek because his mother was there, and because his father's house was there, and because there was something unresolved in him about the mountains that he had been deferring for 19 years, and because the shoulder needed rest, and the rest needed to happen somewhere that would not require him to perform wellness for people who expected it. He had not expected to be useful here. He had not expected the yellow tape, or the dog, or 9 days of vigil over a collapsed mine shaft to give him back the thing that 19 years of SEAL work had not taken, but had thoroughly rearranged. The man in the mine was named Earl Combs. He was 57 years old, a retired miner who had been doing maintenance access on an old pump line in the secondary tunnel when the collapse took the entrance, and whose body, the rescue team had determined on day 3, was almost certainly in the deepest section of the tunnel where the secondary collapse had happened, and whose recovery, the team lead had told the county on day 4, was going to require equipment and expertise that would take time and carry risks to the recovery workers that the team was not authorized to assume without specific protocols. The protocols had been filed. The equipment had been requested. The machinery was coming from a facility 4 hours away and was expected on day 12. None of this was negligence in the legal sense. It was the mathematics of difficult recoveries in difficult terrain, and the county had communicated it as gently as they could to Earl's family, which consisted of a daughter named Darla who lived in Lexington and had driven to Cutter's Creek on day 1 and had not left, and a sister named June who was 72 and sat in a lawn chair 50 yards from the mine entrance every day with a thermos of coffee and a face that had the particular quality of a woman who has already done her worst grieving and is now simply waiting for the world to catch up to what she already knows. And there was Raven, the Doberman, who had been Earl's dog for 4 years, and who had been at the entrance since before the collapse was officially logged, because she had heard or smelled, or understood through whatever mechanism dogs use to understand the things that precede human knowledge that something had gone wrong with the person she considered her central obligation, and she had planted herself accordingly. The local authorities had tried to move her on day 1. The county animal control officer had tried on day 2. Darla had tried on day 3, which was the hardest attempt because Darla had loved her father and Raven knew Darla and had still not moved, which told Darla something about the nature of the vigil that she was not ready to receive. A volunteer from a rescue organization had tried on day 5 with food and patience and a soft voice and the specific technique that worked with most traumatized dogs, and Raven had looked at him with those dark amber eyes and had not moved. She was eating. June brought her food twice a day, setting it at the edge of what Raven had apparently determined was the perimeter of her post, and waiting for Raven to come to it and return to her position. She was drinking from a bowl that June set near the food. She was maintaining herself with the focused, deliberate efficiency of an animal on a long deployment who understands that the mission requires the body to function. She slept in brief intervals at the edge of the rubble and was upright and alert again within minutes. She had not left the shaft entrance. She had not gone more than 6 feet from it in any direction. The county had stopped trying to move her on day 6 because there was nothing useful accomplished by trying, and because she was not interfering with the rescue operation, and because June had said quietly on the morning of day 6 that Raven had as much right to be there as anyone else, and June was the only one whose claim to the property of grief could not be disputed. Patrick had heard about the mine collapse from his mother, who told him about it in the same tone she used for all Harlan County news, which was the tone of someone conveying facts about a world that contained both bad things and the persistent presence of people who dealt with them. He had heard about the dog from his father's old foreman, who was still in Cutter's Creek, and who had mentioned it over coffee at the diner without editorializing, which was the local mode. Patrick had been in Cutter's Creek for 6 weeks and had been doing the things a man with a healing shoulder and no clear next step does, which was to help with the things that needed helping with and to walk the ridges and to sit with what the mountains contained and to try to locate, somewhere in the quiet of that process, the version of himself that existed outside of missions. He had not found it yet. He had found the diner and the foreman and his mother's cooking and the specific way that Harlan County mornings smelled, which was green and mineral, and old in a way that the places he had operated had never been, because those places were old in a way that contained violence, and this place was old in a way that contained endurance, which was a different quality and one that he had needed to return to without knowing he needed it. He pulled over on the county road on the morning of day 9 because something about the image of the dog through the windshield stopped him in a way that was not entirely rational, and that he therefore trusted, because 19 years of SEAL work had taught him to trust the non-rational stops. He had seen the yellow tape and the emergency equipment and the small cluster of people near the entrance, and he had seen Raven, and he had understood without being told what the animal at the rubble meant, because he had been in enough situations where a living thing was maintaining a position at the site of a loss that was not yet acknowledged by the official record. And the posture was always the same posture, which was the posture of someone who had not received the information that everyone else was operating on and was waiting for the record to be corrected. He sat in his truck for 12 minutes, which he knew because he checked the time when he got out, as a man with 19 years of operational discipline checks time at the beginning of things. Then he got out and walked to within 30 feet of the tape and crouched with his hands open and low, and Raven looked at him across the distance with the dark, exhausted intelligence of a dog who has already rejected 9 days of approaches and is assessing whether this one is different. He did not say anything for 4 minutes. He had learned in the Navy that silence was information, and what he was communicating with it was that he was not in a hurry, and he was not going to demand anything from her, and he understood that she was in charge of the terms of this particular encounter. Raven watched him for the 4 minutes without moving, and then she turned and looked at the rubble, and then she turned back and looked at him, and then she walked to him. Not to the perimeter of her post, not a partial approach. She walked to him completely, until she was standing directly in front of him at the distance where a dog stands when she has decided to allow contact, and Patrick put his hand out palm up and she pressed her nose to it, and he felt the 9 days in her nose, the cold and the waiting and the not eating enough and the watching, and he put his other hand gently on the side of her head and she did not pull away. June was watching from her lawn chair. June said nothing. She refilled her thermos and said nothing. He came back the following morning and the morning after that. He did not try to move Raven from the entrance. He did not try to redirect her attention or give her commands or manage her in any way. He simply came and sat near the perimeter of her post and was present, and Raven's approach on the second morning was faster than on the first, and on the third morning she met him at the tape line, and on the fourth morning she walked to the truck when she heard it coming. He brought June coffee and June told him about Earl, not about his death but about his life, which was an important distinction, and one that June observed naturally, and that Patrick was grateful for. She told him that Earl had been a difficult man to love, private and stubborn and specific in his opinions, and slow to change them, but that he had loved Raven without reservation in the way that certain guarded people love animals, which was to give the animal everything they could not give to the world that had disappointed them, and that Raven had received this without judgment, and had given back the uncomplicated loyalty that only dogs could reliably provide. Patrick listened and thought about his own father, who had worked this same mountain, and who had been a difficult man to love in many of the same ways, and who had been easier to appreciate from 19 years of distance than from the same house, and who was still alive and in Cutter's Creek, and with whom Patrick had not yet had the conversation that needed to happen. The machinery arrived on day 12, as estimated, and the recovery operation began. It was 3 days of careful, technical work that Patrick watched from outside the perimeter with Raven beside him, because by day 12, Raven had extended her perimeter to include his position, which June observed without editorial comment, but with an expression that suggested she understood what it meant. On the morning of day 15, Earl Combs was brought out of the mine, and the county had prepared Darla for what that would look like and what it would mean, and June simply stood up from her lawn chair when the team came out and walked to the entrance with the steady, dignified walk of a woman who had been waiting to complete something that needed to be completed. Raven walked with June. Patrick stood outside the perimeter with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched the dog he had been sitting with for 6 mornings walk to the entrance of the mine that had held her person for 15 days, and stand there while the team completed their work, and then turn around and walk back to Patrick. Not to the perimeter, to Patrick. She sat beside his boot and looked up at him with those amber eyes, and he crouched down and put both hands on the sides of her broad, dark head. And she pressed into his hands with all of the 15 days and the 9 before he arrived, and he said, I know quietly the way he had learned to say things when there was nothing more specific available, but the specific was required anyway. Darla took Raven to Lexington, which was the arrangement that had been discussed with the rescue organization, and that made practical sense, and that Raven appeared to accept with the quiet resignation of a dog that has completed one chapter and understands the next has different terms. But before Darla's car left the county road, she stopped and rolled down the window and said to Patrick, whatever you did for her out there, she wouldn't let anyone near her for 9 days, and you walked up and she just. And then Darla did not finish the sentence because finishing it required a word she did not have, and Patrick nodded because he understood, and because he did not have the word either. What he had instead was 6 mornings at a mine entrance in the company of a Doberman who had been conducting a vigil that the official record could not accommodate, and the understanding, arrived at through proximity rather than through thought, that the work he had done in 19 years had been a form of vigil too, a keeping of faith with something larger than himself that required presence and patience, and the willingness to stay at the perimeter of loss without demanding that it organize itself into a form he could manage. He drove to his father's house that afternoon. His father was on the porch when he pulled up, because his father was always on the porch in the afternoon. And Patrick got out of the truck and walked to the porch and sat down in the other chair, and his father poured him a coffee from the thermos he always had out there, and neither of them said anything for a while. And the mountain was green and old above them, and the mine was down the road, and Earl Combs was home at last in the only way available to him. And Patrick Callahan, for the first time in 14 months, did not feel like a man between deployments. He felt like a man who had come back somewhere specific and found something specific waiting there, which was the conversation he had been putting off and the father he had been orbiting and the mountains that had made both of them in the way mountains make the people who grow up in their shadow, which is slowly and permanently and without apology. He got a dog the following spring. A black Doberman, 8 weeks old, a female. He named her Ember. His father met her on the porch on the third day and held her in both hands the way old miners hold small things, carefully, as if aware of the force contained in their own grip. And he said, "She's going to be trouble." And Patrick said yes she was, and his father almost smiled, and that was the beginning of the conversation that had been waiting on the porch for 14 months. Some things do not resolve until another thing shows you the shape of the resolution. Some vigils are not for the one who stayed. Some of them are for the one who arrived on day 9 and finally understood what staying at the entrance of the place where you lost something means, and what it costs, and why it is worth the cost anyway. Patrick Callahan drove back to Cutter's Creek looking for whatever came after a Navy SEAL career, and he found it at a mine entrance in the company of a dog who would not move. And what he found was not a mission, but something older than missions, which was the knowledge of what he belonged to and the willingness to stay near it. If this story reached you tonight, share it with someone who is standing at the entrance of something and does not yet know why they cannot move on. Tell us in the comments which moment broke you open and which city you are watching from. And if you can, support a coal country community organization or a Doberman rescue near you. Subscribe to this channel and we will keep finding these stories.